My hands looked different. That is the first thing I remember noticing, lying in the bed in the room where I had given birth the day before, looking at my own hands in the thin winter light, and thinking, these look like someone else's hands. They were the same hands. Same knuckles, same calluses from years of work, same small scar on my left thumb from a kitchen knife when I was 9. But they felt far away. Everything felt far away. The baby was sleeping. The house around me was awake and moving. And I was somewhere between the two, not quite in my body, not quite out of it. Still arriving. I'm Rebecca, and this is Plain and Still, a place for the stories that live in the spaces between what happened and what was said about it. If something here finds you, subscribe and stay close. And I want to ask you something. Has anyone ever handed you something when what you needed was to simply be held? Leave it in the comments. I was 22 years old, and I had been a wife for 2 years, and now, in the space of one long night, I had become a mother. That is how quickly the world rearranges itself. One night, and the person you were before, it is simply the person you were before it, a fact, a category, something with edges you can name now that you are on the other side of it. I had known this was coming. I had prepared for it, in the way that Amish women prepare for the things they know are coming, practically, functionally, with the unsentimental competence of a community that has been doing this for generations. I had been told it would be hard. No one had told me what hard would feel like from the inside of my own body. That is not a criticism. It is simply true. The room was cold in the way that January rooms are cold when the fire has been banked for the night. Not sharp cold, but settled cold, the kind that has been there long enough to become part of the air. The light coming through the window was flat and white. I could hear the house around me. Footsteps on the floor above, the sound of something being set down in the kitchen, a door opening and closing somewhere. The house was awake. The house had not paused. I lay in the bed, and I listened to the house continue, and I thought, not with bitterness, just with a kind of quiet noticing, that I had expected the world to feel slightly different on the other side of what my body had just done. It felt exactly the same. Only I was different. And no one seemed to have registered that yet. Something happened in those first days that I have turned over for years, trying to find the right frame for it. I want to be careful about how I say this. It was not the worst thing that happened in my marriage. It was not a crisis. It did not leave a mark that anyone from the outside could have seen or named. What makes it difficult to hold is precisely that it was ordinary. In that room, in that house, among those people who loved me, what happened was simply how things were done. No one thought anything unusual was occurring. No one intended harm. That is, I have found the hardest kind of thing to talk about, the thing that hurt you quietly in a room full of people who would have been genuinely bewildered to know it. I had been married at 20, which was considered a good age in my community. Not rushed, not delayed, simply right. My husband Jonas was steady and kind, and we had built the first 2 years of our life together with the particular patient competence of 2 people who had been raised to build things carefully. The pregnancy had been unremarkable by the standards of May, attended by a midwife, discussed in practical terms, prepared for in practical ways. What was discussed? What to expect during the birth, what the baby would need, how the household would adjust. What was not discussed, what I now understand was not in the vocabulary of the preparation at all, was what I would need. What my body would be in the days after. What rest meant, and why it was not weakness. These were not omissions born of cruelty. They were simply not topics. They had never been topics. They had never needed to be. In my community, a woman was expected to be up and moving within days of giving birth, sometimes sooner depending on the household, the season, the work that was waiting. I want to say clearly, this was not considered harshness. It was considered strength. It was the inherited understanding of a people who had survived for generations through the steady continuation of labor, who had built a life in which stillness and luxury were almost the same word, who had no framework, no language, no tradition, no even the idea of recovery as a form of work the body does that deserves to be honored. My own mother had risen from each of her births and continued. My grandmother before her. The women in my district had done the same. The expectation was as natural as cold in January. I had grown up inside it. It had never occurred to me to question the weather. My mother-in-law was a capable woman. I want you to understand her fully before I tell you what happened, because what happened only makes sense in the full light of who she was. She had given birth 7 times. She had built a household and raised children and managed the particular complexity of an Amish farm through every season for 30 years, and she had done all of it with a steadiness I genuinely admired. She was not unkind. She was the specific kind of loving that expresses itself through doing, through maintaining, through the continuation of order in the face of whatever the day brought. Her care for me was real. I had felt it throughout my pregnancy in small and consistent ways. Her care arrived in the form of action, of usefulness, of things done and things managed. She did not sit with people and ask how they were. She arrived and she worked, and that was how she said, "I love you." I had known this about her. What I had not known yet was what it would cost me. She came to the room on the 2nd day. I was lying down. The baby was sleeping in the small wooden cradle Jonas had made. I remember watching it breathe, the particular rise and fall of something so new it had barely arrived yet. I heard my mother-in-law's footsteps in the hallway. I knew them by then, their particular rhythm, purposeful, even the steps of a woman who always knew where she was going. And I felt, in the moment before she opened the door, something I have never quite admitted out loud. I felt hope, small and private and utterly genuine. I hoped she was coming to sit with me, to set down whatever she was carrying and simply be near me in that room without requiring anything from either of us. I wanted that so much I held very still, as though stillness might make it more likely. I want you to hold that hope for a moment, because of what she was actually carrying. She came in. She was warm. She looked at the baby, said something tender about its face, touched its cheek with one careful finger. Then she set something down near the bed. A basket. The household laundry, accumulated over the days of the birth and the day after, sheets and work clothes and the small ordinary pile of things that a house produces, simply by being lived in. She said it needed doing. She said it in the easy, practical tone of a woman communicating information, not issuing a command. She may have said she would help if I needed it. I don't remember exactly. What I remember is the basket, the weight of it sitting there, and the particular quality of the feeling that moved through me when I looked at it, something I did not have a word for yet, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. I lay there after she left and I looked at the basket and I understood, without being able to say it, that my body, what it had done, what it still needed, was not the most important thing in this room. I did the laundry. I want to say that plainly because the plainness of it is the point. I got up. I moved slowly, the way you move when your body is asking you with every step to reconsider, and I did what was in the basket. Not because anyone stood over me. Not because there was a consequence named or threatened. I did it because the alternative required something I had not been given, the language to say I cannot yet. To say I need more time. To say my body is still in the middle of something, and the laundry will have to wait. Those sentences did not exist in the vocabulary I had been raised with. The doing was simply easier than the asking. That is the first truth of this story, and it is the one that took me longest to say out loud. I stood at the washboard, and I worked slowly and methodically because slow and methodical was what I had. My hands were still the hands that had looked unfamiliar to me the morning before, still a little distant, still belonging to a body that was making its way back from somewhere. The water was cold at first, and then warm, and I moved through the pile with the particular concentration of a person who is using a task to keep herself from noticing something else. I finished. I hung what needed hanging. I went back to bed and lay down, and the house continued around me, and no one said anything about it. Not in praise, not in question. It was simply done. That was the whole of it. That was also, I understand now, the whole of the problem. What I felt in the days that followed was not anger at my mother-in-law. I want to be precise about this, because imprecision here would be dishonest, and also unfair to her. What I felt was something more diffuse and harder to locate, a specific kind of invisibility that I had not encountered before in quite that form. The community had received my baby with warmth and celebration. There were visitors and food, and the particular tenderness that an Amish community extends to a new life. I was acknowledged in all of that, as the vessel for it, as the mother of it. But the body that had produced the child, its exhaustion, its soreness, the particular rawness of a woman 2 days postpartum, that body was expected to continue as though the production had been incidental. I was celebrated as a mother. I was invisible as a woman. Those are not the same thing. I did not know then that I was allowed to notice the difference. There was a morning, 4 or 5 days in, when I woke before anyone else. The house was completely still. The baby had been fed and had gone back to sleep, and I was sitting in the chair beside the cradle in the gray early light, and I was holding this new person, this entirely new person who had not existed before, and now simply was warm and heavy and breathing against my chest. And I felt something I can only describe as the world stopping for a moment and allowing itself to be exactly what it was. It was not complicated. It was not mixed with anything. It was simply beauty, uncomplicated and complete, in the particular way that very new things are sometimes beautiful because they don't know yet what they're going to cost. I held that. I want you to know I held that. The difficulty and the beauty were in the same days, sometimes the same hour. Both were real. Neither canceled the other. I came to understand, slowly and without any single moment of arrival, that what had happened with the laundry was not my mother-in-law's invention. It was older than her. Much older. It was the shape of a community that had never, in its long, careful, genuinely loving history, built a space for a woman's body to rest after birth, because rest had never been classified as a need. The women who had come before had not complained. Not because they were not tired, they were tired, they must have been, but because the category of I need to stop did not exist in the language they had inherited, and language that doesn't exist cannot be spoken, and things that cannot be spoken become things that do not happen. My mother-in-law had done what had been done to her. Her mother had done what had been done to her mother. The basket was older than any of us. It had been handed down through generations of women who loved each other and never once thought to set it aside. The following spring I went to a frolic, the kind of community gathering where women come together to work, to quilt or preserve or simply be near each other in the particular companionable way that shared labor allows. A woman named Miriam was there. She was from my district, married a few years longer than I had been, and she had given birth to her second child 3 weeks before. She was there, working, hands moving through the task with the steady competence that I recognized, the competence of a woman who has learned to keep moving because stopping is not offered as an option. I watched her for a while. Later, when we were briefly alone, I asked her quietly how she was feeling. She looked at me for a moment. A particular kind of look, the kind that happens when someone asks a question and means it and you haven't been asked a question that meant anything in a while. Then she said, "I haven't stopped yet. I keep thinking that when I stop, I'll feel how tired I am." She went back to work. I stood there and felt the truth of those 2 sentences settle into me like something I had already known but hadn't had words for yet. If you have ever kept moving because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing, I want you to know I see that. Completely. I'm Rebecca, and this is plain and still, a space for the things that lived in the silence. If this story is finding you, I'd love for you to subscribe and stay. And tell me in the comments, has anyone ever handed you something when what you actually needed was to simply be held? 1 word, 10 words, whatever you have. I read every one, and I keep them. My mother-in-law loved me. I have arrived at this understanding not as a consolation but as a fact, clean and true, and not in competition with anything else I have told you. She loved me in the full language available to her, which was the language of doing, of maintaining, of the basket carried in, and the household kept moving. The community that shaped that language also shaped its limits, and those limits were not her fault any more than the cold in January is the fault of the window. The basket was handed with genuine care. The care was real. The gap between what I needed and what arrived was also real. I have stopped asking which of those facts is supposed to win. They are both simply true, the way most things that matter are simply true, complicated and whole, and not requiring resolution. What changed in me happened quietly, over months and then years, in the small private spaces of my own life. I did not confront my mother-in-law. I did not make a declaration. What I did was begin slowly and without ceremony to build something inside my understanding of myself, The knowledge that my body's needs were real, that rest was not indulgence, that asking for care was not failure. I did not learn this from anyone in my community. There was no one to teach it to me there. I arrived at it alone, in the early mornings before the house woke, in the particular silence of a woman sitting with herself honestly and asking, "What do I actually need today?" And learning, slowly, imperfectly, with many days of the old reflexes before the new ones, to wait for a true answer. You may have had a laundry basket of your own. Not literal laundry, something else, something handed to you at the exact moment when your body or your life or your heart had just done something enormous and needed, before anything else, to be acknowledged. Someone who loved you genuinely, handing you the next task before the last one had been witnessed. If that is you, if you have been needed before you were held, I want you to know that what you needed was real. The fact that it wasn't given doesn't mean it wasn't owed. When my daughter had her first child, I went to her house. I did not bring a task. I sat beside her. I asked how she was, and I waited, past the first answer, which was the trained one, and into the second, which was true. That is what I had to give her. That stillness. That waiting. The particular message of a woman who sits down beside you and does not hand you anything. It is where everything else begins. It is, I think, what we were all always asking for. We just didn't have anyone to show us it was allowed.